Good morning. We're going to spend most of our time today in 2 Kings chapter 2 and talking about the relationship between Elijah and Elisha. Now, I'd certainly like to welcome our visitors we have with us this morning, and the lesson I hope will have some meaning to you. We're talking about saying goodbye, and from time to time in our lives, we all experience that, where we have to say goodbye, whether it's somebody moving and leaving to a different part of the country, a different part of the world, and we know we probably won't see them as often, or sometimes it's a departure from this world. We say goodbyes, and sometimes we're the one that's saying a goodbye, sometimes we're the one that is saying goodbye to our friend who is leaving us. So this lesson has meaning to everybody, but I also think for those who are regular members of this local body, I'm not really trying to hide greatly the meaning behind the lesson here. I think you'll know what we're getting at. When we talk about Elijah, first of all, very powerful prophet, did incredible things in the Bible. When we read about him, first mention is in chapter 17, 1 Kings chapter 17. He comes to oppose Ahab. Now, Elijah and Elisha were primarily in the north. This is during the divided kingdom, and we know the north was by far the more apostate, the more wicked of the two nations when Israel split in half. And so in 1 Kings chapter 17, he comes and opposes Ahab, and as the law of Moses foretold, that when they didn't obey God, when they strayed from the commandments of the law that was given to them by Moses on Mount Sinai, God would punish them. He would send enemies against them. He would not give them victory over their enemies, but he also told them specifically the rains will stop, the ground will dry up, and it will fail to produce crops the way you need them to. And so this is exactly what Elijah prayed for, and we read about this in James chapter 5. The New Testament speaks of Elijah and Elisha both, and speaks of them as men who accomplished incredible things through the power of God. In chapter 5, we're told that prayer can accomplish much, and the effective fervent prayer of a righteous man accomplishes much. And we're told about Elijah, a man with a nature like ours, and that says that Elijah didn't have something different, something special that separates him from you and I, other than his faith. He wasn't part angel. He wasn't some superhuman. He was a human, you and I, just another man. But he put his faith in God and accomplished incredible things. James chapter 5, verse 17, Elijah was a man with a nature like ours, and he prayed earnestly that it might not rain. And it did not rain on the earth for 3 years and months. And he prayed again, and the sky poured rain, and the earth produced its fruit. And so he accomplished great things and opposed the wickedness that was going on in Israel. And during that time, we read about him resurrecting the young child of a widow with whom he was staying at the time, and did other great miracles. So a little bit later in 1 Kings chapter 17, he cures or raises from the dead that young child. 1 Kings chapter 18, probably the most well-known story. When you go to 1 Kings chapter 18, we read about Elijah, that he stood against 450 prophets of Baal. And I believe 400 prophets of the Asherah were there as well. And he opposed these prophets because Jezebel, well, she had no faith whatsoever in the God of Israel, and she led Israel as well as her husband Ahab in a very wicked direction. And so it was her mission, it was Jezebel's mission to eradicate all the prophets of God, and she was doing so very effectively. There were a few righteous people that were hiding prophets and saving them from the mass execution that was going on. And so here we have Elijah who opposes all of this wickedness. And they have this test where they have two altars, and he says, why don't you offer up prayers and supplications to the Baals and see if they will come and produce a fire and take up your sacrifice. And all day long, nothing happens. And they're hitting their backs with whips and to the point where blood is coming out. And Elijah mocks them and says, maybe your gods have gone on a vacation. Call out a little bit louder. And so has them soak his altar with water to the point where it's flowing over. And then the fires come down out of heaven and consume the altar. And they know which God was the real God at that point. A great story, 1 Kings chapter 18, and they put to death those prophets of the Baals. Yet, no matter how incredible somebody is in the Bible, their story always comes to an end. And so when we get to chapter 19, and we'll read about that in just a moment, and just briefly though, in Matthew, one other thing I'd like to point out, I forgot about this. In Matthew chapter 11, there were prophecies in the Old Testament that Elijah would return, someone with the spirit and power of Elijah. So again, this tells you that he stood out among other prophets as someone who was distinctly powerful and faithful, someone who would come again. And so in Matthew chapter 11, Jesus makes it plain and helps us understand. Well, the Elijah of prophecy, the Elijah who would come, that was John the Baptist. Matthew chapter 11, verse 14, if you care to accept it, he himself is Elijah who was to come. Referencing numerous prophecies about the forerunner, someone who would come before the Messiah and make ready the way, who would come in the spirit and power of Elijah. And so he was a foreshadow of John the Baptist. And also something that is incredible when you think about it in Matthew chapter 17, at the Transfiguration, where Jesus is transfigured before his disciples, before Peter, James, and John specifically. It says in verse 3, as his face shone like the sun and his garments became as white as light, behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with him. Moses, I think we easily understand why he's there. He delivered the law. The law of the Old Testament is synonymous with Moses. It's the law of Moses. But sometimes I don't think we understand how important Elijah was. Just how great of a prophet he was if we were to rank the prophets. He's there at the Transfiguration. He and Moses are conversing with Jesus. So that tells you that he was definitely in the elite category among prophets. Yet even Elijah had an end to his story. His time expired. And so we come to chapter 19, 1 Kings chapter 19, and it's kind of after opposing these prophets of Baal and being victorious because he trusted in God, well, Jezebel just renews her efforts and swears that she is going to kill Elijah. And we see in chapter 19, verse 1, now Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, so may the gods do to me, and even more if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time. And he was afraid and arose and ran for his life. And so as great of a prophet as we might categorize Elijah, he's still subject to emotion, to fear. And so he runs for his life. And he comes to Beersheba, and it says there in verse 4, he went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a juniper tree, and he requested for himself that he might die. Kind of reminds you of Moses, like we've been talking about on Wednesday nights. Moses was so exhausted by taking care of and looking after the people of Israel that he says, it's too much for me, for one man. Please end my life now. I'm finished. And that's exactly what Elijah says here. It is enough. Now, O Lord, take my life, for I am not better than my fathers. And he laid down and fell asleep in verse 5 until an angel awoke him and said, arise and eat. And verse 6, then he looked, and behold, there was at his head a bread cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. So he ate and drank and lay down, and the angel of the Lord came again a second time and touched him and said, arise, eat, because the journey is too great for you. That's God's way of saying, build up your strength. You got a little more left to do. You're not finished yet. And so he tells him, you've got some jobs. You've got specific tasks. God reminds him, you are not alone. You're not the last faithful person in all of Israel or Judah. I have kept my faithful. And so he says, starting in verse 15, go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you have arrived, you shall anoint Hazael king over Aram, and Jehu the son of Nimshi you shall anoint king over Israel, and Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel you shall anoint as prophet in your place. So he says, Elijah, you're not alone. You're not the last faithful person left. I've got a faithful remnant, and I always do. I always have a faithful remnant. And not some work for you yet. You're going to go and appoint and anoint a new king in Aram. You're going to anoint a new king in Jerusalem or in Israel, and you're going to appoint your successor. That is Elisha. So he is called to replace Elijah, and that's a pretty big role to fill. Those are pretty big boots to step into. And so when we go a little bit later, verse 19. Still in 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 19, so Elijah, it says, he departed from there and found Elisha the son of Shaphat while he was plowing with 12 pairs of oxen before him, and he went with the 12th. And Elijah passed over to him and threw his mantle on him. That's something that might not mean a lot to us, but symbolically, that's a passing of the torch. And I think they understood. I think both of them understood exactly what it means. Because God told Elijah, you're going to go and anoint Elisha to take your place. Elijah definitely knew what it meant. And I think Elisha understood the significance as well. Because in verse 20, he left the oxen and ran after Elijah and said, please let me kiss my father and my mother, then I will follow you. I think he understood what this meant. So he was called to take the place of Elijah. Luke chapter 4. Again, the New Testament gives a nod, acknowledging the incredible faith and stature of these two prophets. In Luke chapter 4, we have another reference to the earlier discussed story of the rain stopping. So Luke chapter 4, verse 25, but I say to you in truth, there were many widows in Israel in the days of Elijah, when the sky was shut up for 3 years and 6 months, when a great famine came over all the... Yet Elijah was sent to none of them, but only to Zarephath in the land of Sidon, to a woman who was a widow. So that references Elijah stopping the rain, as well as staying with that widow and raising her son from the dead. But he also gives a nod in verse 27. Luke 4 in verse 27. And there were many lepers in Israel in the time of Elisha the prophet, and none of them was cleansed, only Naaman the Syrian. And you read about that a few chapters later, 2 Kings chapter 5. One of those great stories, I believe, that foreshadows the significance of baptism as playing a role in our salvation. But we see a little bit about each of these two men. They were both very great prophets, very great in stature, very great in faith, subject to human weakness just same as all of us, emotions, being afraid of distress or threats of death. But they were both very great men, and the New Testament acknowledges that, talking of the great miracles that they performed. And so Elijah is to go and anoint Elisha in his place. It takes place 1 Kings chapter 19. But the story I wanted to focus on is in 2 Kings chapter 2. We don't read much about Elisha. He's been anointed and he goes along with Elijah, but we don't read much about him until it's Elijah's time to depart. And so we get this departure, this farewell in 2 Kings chapter 2. Right out of the gate, 2 Kings chapter 2, when you read the first couple of verses, there's no spoiler alerts here. He just kind of spills the beans and lets us know what's about to happen. 2 Kings chapter 2, in verse 1, it came about when the Lord was about to take up Elijah by a whirlwind to heaven that Elijah went with Elisha from Gilgal. So we know ahead of time what's going to happen in this chapter. God is preparing to take away Elijah. It is reminiscent somewhat of Enoch in the book of Genesis, that we don't really read that Enoch died in the way that all other men do, but that he was just taken away with God. And this seems to be the indication of what's going to happen, that he's going to take up Elijah by a whirlwind. And so this is what's going to happen. We know it's Elijah's time to depart. So I'd like to read through most of 2 Kings chapter 2, and then we're going to make a very simple observation and application of this text before we wrap up the lesson this morning. We know that his time has come. Verse 2, 2 Kings chapter 2 and verse 2. And Elijah said to Elisha, stay here, please, for the Lord has sent me as far as Bethel. But Elisha said, as the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you. So they went down to Bethel. Then the sons of the prophets who were at Bethel came out to Elisha and said to him, do you know that the Lord will take away your master from over you today? And he said, yes, I know. Still. And Elijah said to Elisha, please stay here, for the Lord has sent me to Jericho. But he said, as the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you. So they came to Jericho. And the sons of the prophets who were at Jericho approached Elisha and said to him, do you know that the Lord will take away your master from over you today? And he answered, yes, I know. Be still. Other translations, by the way, say, keep quiet. I want to hear this. Verse 6, then Elijah said to him, please stay here, for the Lord has sent me to the Jordan. That as the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you. So the two of them went on. Now 50 men of the sons of the prophets went and stood opposite them at a distance, while the two of them stood by the Jordan. And Elijah took his mantle and folded it together and struck the waters, and they were divided here and there, so that the two of them crossed over on dry ground. Now it came about when they had crossed over that Elijah said to Elisha, ask what I shall do for you before I am taken from you. And Elisha said, please, let a double portion of your spirit be upon me. And he said, you have asked a hard thing. Nevertheless, if you see me when I am taken from you, it shall be so for you. But if not, it shall not be so. Then it came about as they were going along and talking, that behold, there appeared a chariot of fire and horses of fire, which separated the two of them. And Elisha went up by a whirlwind into heaven. And Elisha saw it and cried out, Father, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. And he saw him no more. Then he took hold of his own clothes and tore them in two pieces. He also took the mantle of Elijah that fell from him and returned and stood by the bank of the Jordan. We'll stop there and just make some observations before we go back and finish up a few verses in this chapter. Like I said, this is a relatable story. This is a relatable situation to everybody. We all have to say goodbye to people that we love, to family, to friends. For each and every one of us, there is going to come the day when we are in the place of Elijah saying our goodbyes to our friends. I think when we look at this story, we can take away something from each of these two men that we might do well to remember when we're in one of those two positions. So we're going to start with Elisha. Elisha is the one who's staying behind. The first thing I notice about Elisha is he doesn't really want to talk about this. And I'll admit something to you. I can really relate to this. I don't like to face goodbyes. I don't like to really think too hard about them. A number of times the prophets, the sons of the prophets, come to Elisha and say, you know your master's going to be taken away from you today, right? He says, I know. Be quiet. I don't want to talk about this. For that matter, we don't see Elijah talking about it too much. And I think that's okay. We need to acknowledge this as a reality of life, but it's okay. It's okay to say we don't really want to think about this. That's one lesson we take away from this. Elisha doesn't really want to deal with this, but he has to. That's just the way life is. But what I really admire about Elisha is he wants to stay with him. He says, as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not depart you. Every time they come to a new stop on their journey, Elijah says, you just stay behind here. God has told me to go on further. You wait here and stay, but I'm going to go. And Elisha says, no, I am with you to the very end. That's a beautiful sentiment. And he's the one that is expressing grief. I find this to be very sudden. When you go to verse 12, or rather verse 11, even the illustration at the very first slide, it shows Elijah in the chariot, but this is something Dennis and I were discussing, and he pointed this out, that it doesn't really say that Elijah rode in the chariot. It says the chariot primarily served to separate two of them. When I read this, it seems like this happened very suddenly. It came about as they were going along and talking, that behold, there approached a chariot of fire and horses of fire, which separated the two of them. It seems like it happened very quickly. They knew it was coming, but maybe they weren't ready for it. They wanted to keep on talking as if it wasn't going to happen, but it did. And we see his reaction. Elisha saw it and cried out, my father, my father. We know that biologically it wasn't father and son relationship, but it felt like that to these two men. And it's very reminiscent of the comments that Jordan made between Paul the apostle and the young man Timothy, his child in the faith. They had a very father and son type relationship. And so it's no wonder that Elisha saw it and cried out. And it says that he tore his clothes in two pieces. He's the one that is in grief. He's the one that is sad. And that also tells me it's okay. It's okay to not really want to go head first into this conversation. It's okay to say, I don't really want to talk about this a lot. But it's also okay to experience and express a little bit of grief in these scenarios. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, let me break from our text for just a moment. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, it's okay for the Christian to experience grief. But we need to remember, we don't grieve the way others do that don't have the same hope as us. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, beginning in verse 13. But we do not want you to be uninformed, brethren, about those who are asleep, that you may not grieve, as do the rest who have no hope. For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep in Jesus. For this we say to you by the word of the Lord. And I love that Paul says this comes directly from God. This is Jesus' own words, his promise, that we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord shall not precede those who have fallen asleep. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, with the trumpet of God. The dead in Christ shall rise first, and we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and thus we shall always be with the Lord. Therefore comfort one another with these words. It says, we grieve, but we don't grieve the same way as other people do because we have hope. When you go back to 2 Kings chapter 2, you see that he expresses his grief. He wanted to be with his friend, his father figure, to the very end. He didn't want him to depart and be gone. And so he tore his clothes and cried out after him. But we also noticed in verse 13 of our text, he took up the mantle of Elijah that fell from him and returned and stood by the bank of the Jordan. He had his moment of grief and sorrow. But it was his turn. He had taken up the mantle. Elijah had rest from his battle, but now it's Elisha's turn to take up the fight and continue the good fight. He couldn't dwell his grief. There was too much work to be done. And it's great when you read on in the text throughout 2 Kings, you find that during the time of Elisha, that Baal worship was eradicated from Israel. He had to do, and he accomplished a lot. But it's okay to express your grief and experience grief and sorrow. A few lessons we learned from Elisha. And so when we're the ones in this position, say bye to our beloved, our loved ones, our friends, we might not want to talk about it, but we need to accept it as a reality. And we need to be there for them until the very end, just like Elisha. I'm not going to leave you. As long as you're alive, I'll be there for you. I'll be there with you. That's the attitude we need to adopt. It's okay to be sorry. It's okay to have sorrow and grief. But we all need to understand the battle goes on. We have work to do. And we don't grieve as somebody that doesn't have hope. We'll see them again. Now, Elijah. The grief, the tears, he seems to leave that to Elisha. Yeah, Elijah isn't really that anxious to talk about this subject either, but he doesn't seem too choked up about it either. We read in 1 Kings chapter 19, he was ready for this. He had fought hard. And I think he's accepting of this. He's ready for this. But I love that he shows concern. He says in verse 9 that Elijah said to Elisha, "Ask what I shall do for you before I am taken from you." When we find ourselves in this position, and I need to point out that Elijah had the benefit of knowing the exact day of his departure. We don't. Now, sometimes we know somebody's going. We can see the writing on the wall. All the sons of the prophets kept telling Elisha, everybody knows it, your master's going today. Sometimes we know, but for the most part, we aren't have the same benefit. We need to take some precautions and be thoughtful we're excited. We look forward to what lies beyond because we have hope, because we have great promises from our Savior. But I love that Elijah is mindful of those who he's leaving behind. What can I do for you? What do you need before I go? We need to think about this. The loved ones in our lives. What can we do to take care of them? What do they need before it's our time to say goodbye? Sometimes it can be mundane things. Again, we don't like to talk about this subject, but we do need to accept it as reality and address it. I have loved everything, almost everything about being a father over these past 2 years. The one thing I don't like is that Navy is turning me into a grown-up and making me do grown-up things. I have gotten life insurance. I have written a will. These are the things I just didn't really want to think about. But when I look at my daughter, I think I need to think about these things. I need to think about if something happens. I need to be mindful of what am I going to do for those that I love if my time comes to go. You know, 1 Timothy 5, it talks about if a man is not going to take care or provide for his own, he's worse than an unbeliever. We might not really want to think about those things, but if you left, what kind of position would your family be in? We need to think about that. Sometimes it can be as simple as maybe I need to express my love, my gratitude. I still don't know if I've expressed my gratitude properly or if I ever will be able to my parents. I certainly didn't acknowledge or understand all that they had done, all the sacrifices they made when I was a child. I'm starting to understand it now, but I need to tell them that. I need to express to them how thankful I am for the kind of parents they were. I need to tell my wife, my children, every day that I love them. We don't always do good at that. Sometimes it can be something that is not very easy, and Elijah even acknowledged that. He said, Elisha, what you asked is a hard thing. You've asked something very difficult of me. Sometimes it can be a rebuke. What do our loved ones need before we go? Maybe it's correction. Telling them something that they don't want to hear but need to hear. My time to go is at hand, but I love you dearly. And I can see the path you're headed down, and I want you to be there for all eternity with all the saved, all the loved ones of God, and be there with God for all eternity. And I hope you think about making some changes in your life. It can be any number of things. That's one thing I take away from this lesson. So I love that he was mindful of Elisha. I'm leaving you behind, but what can I do? What do you need before I go? This is a very, very beautiful story. And so I love some of the lessons about this. Like I said, for those members of this local body, I think you probably know what I'm talking about. I'm not trying to hide it. But the reality is we're all going to face these situations. We're all going to say goodbye to a loved one. At some point, we are going to be the ones saying goodbye. And I think how we approach those situations matters a great deal to God. We learn a lot from this story. And I can't help but find a great parallel. Just a final reminder before we sing our invitation song. In Philippians chapter 1, I find a great parallel in the relationship between Paul and Timothy as well as Titus. Paul was mindful of his departure. And in 2 Timothy chapter 4, he said, I've ran the race. I've completed the course. I'm already being poured out a drink offering. My time to depart is at hand. He said, I'm about to go. But he sent and wrote these letters to Timothy and to Titus, saying, I want you to be strong. I want you to be courageous. I want you to stand up and do the work that I know you can do. He was mindful of their needs before he left, but I think Philippians chapter 1, this reminds us of this beautiful story and this hope that we have. We don't look at these goodbyes the same way other people do. We say our goodbye with and trust and faith in our God. Philippians chapter 1, beginning in verse 21, Paul says, For to me to live is Christ, to die is gain. Do we really believe that? Are you ready to bank your life on that? I really believe that to die is gain. But if I am to live on in the flesh, this will mean fruitful labor for me, and I do not know which is to choose, which is better to choose. But I am hard pressed from both directions, having the desire to depart and be with Christ, for that is very much better. I'd like to leave the lesson there with you. Those simple words. That is very much better to be with Christ. It's not easy to say goodbye. I really relate to Elisha. You want to talk about somebody who's going to be leaving? I said, I don't want to talk about this. But I want to be there with them till the very end. When it's my time to go, I hope I'm thoughtful of the needs of those I leave behind. But ultimately, we move on. We gain. It is very much better to be with Christ. If your life is not right with God, you don't know when your day is going to come. Elijah did. He knew the very day. We don't. Today is the day you need to be right with God. If we can help you in that way, if we can help you get your life right by God, we invite you to please come forward now as we stand and sing.